Thank you, Joseph, for putting this all together, and thank you to all the other people bringing papers and to Jacques' responses. I'm looking forward to the discussion this afternoon. It's already been an interesting day, and I'm sure it's going to just keep ramping up. So I typically don't actually like to do the presentation style where I recite verbatim the paper that I've written. And I also really don't like the presentation style of flipping through slides and leaving them uncommented on. And so I'm going to do both together, just to see what happens when those things rub against one another. But also, I think it's important, since Jacques has taken the time to read our papers and respond to them, that you hear the paper that I had sent to him. And the images that are going to be interrupting my speaking form their own kind of simultaneous argument. And ultimately, there is this question of the gap or the tension between what is sayable and what is visible or what is seeable. And I think at a certain level, the attempt is for this presentation to be a performance. At times, the slides and what I say will have nothing to do with each other. At other times, there'll be various happenstances where they overlap. The images are images all of Montage and the way in which Montage has come to influence architectural image making. We are, depending on when and where you want to situate the origin of Montage within art, if we put it in the Berlin Dada, we're celebrating a centennial. So centennials seem to be celebrated all the time these days, and we've got another one where 100 years of photomontage is upon us. So without further ado, okay. Architecture has a troubled relationship with the image. As an embodied physical experience, an architectural environment is always more than its mere visual appearance. These qualities in excess of the visual are multiple, to list a few: effective haptic and oral sensations, dynamic fragmented shifts of attention, and the contingencies of context in all of its manifestations, from the material to the social to the conceptual. To reduce this dense block of experience and cognition to a visual image loses much of the richness of reality. But if this lack seems wholly evident, then why do we even worry about images? The answer seems simple. Images have powers to sway opinions regarding what is and what is not real through visual resemblance. They can devalue reality into the spectacle of the copy, the fake, the shallow. This aspect of simulation has invoked anxiety throughout the history of Western culture and is a pressing issue today in the accelerated image deluge of digital dissemination. Images make architecture nervous not only for this ability to resemble and persuade, but for another reason as well. Walter Benjamin famously defined architecture as offering the prototype of an artwork that is received in a state of distraction and through the collective. The assumption is that because architecture is built matter, intended for pragmatic daily use, and retreats into the background of attention, that it is somehow more real than image-based mediations. But the built pragmatic background surfaces of architecture go to great lengths to conceal the complexities of social, technological, and material reality in order to present a culturally compelling, coherent order. It holds no privileged position of objectivity, neutrality, or access to the real. Architecture interrupts the experience of reality as an aesthetic mediation, just like other images. This problematic relation between the image and the real is compounded further, considering that architects do not build buildings. They make representations that speculate on future built realities. To put it another way, architects make images in order to control the image of the built environment. Furthermore, these representations provide the basis for a significant amount of architecture's discursive arguments. It thus becomes not only crucial to articulate which modes will best aid the design work of an architect, but equally important to dig deeper into the roles that representations play in the construction of architectural discourse. Not all representations are equal. Within architecture, representations that abstract appearances and often are given a place of privilege, while those that too closely resemble vision are assigned a lower realm of importance. In fact, many architects will use the word image only for this second species, reserving the word drawing for the first. Beginning with Leon Battista Alberti, the perspective image was understood to produce deceptive appearances appropriate for painting, while the orthographic drawings of architecture are valued on account of their fidelity to certain calculated standards. The orthographic drawing enables three aspects: Technologically, it manages and regulates future construction as an imitation of the drawing through the accurate control of length, angle, and proportion. Pedagogically, it requires training in the rigorous production and correct interpretation of drawings through disciplinary conventions. Discursively, it establishes ethical and epistemological foundations related to historically rooted concepts of form and organization, not the ephemerality of visual resemblance. The perspectival image, or rendering, is devalued exactly for its lack of these three qualities. It cannot be measured to control construction, it resembles vision too closely and can thus be appreciated without disciplinary training, and the aesthetic affect can override epistemological and ethical concerns in the service of dubious manipulations. This relationship between ethics, epistemology, and aesthetics is a complex one, and we'll obviously not be able to track its philosophical history in the space of this essay. The entanglement extends back to the formation of Western philosophy, where Plato feared that forsaking of moral essence through the seduction of the senses, in other words, ethics compromised by aesthetics. It's important to note that conflations between ethics, epistemology, and aesthetics often underlie arguments regarding the uses and abuses of the image. Most often, these arguments claim that images mask what is true regarding a situation. Images conceal knowledge. Furthermore, this belief often gains an additional valence. Images conceal knowledge for nefarious intentions. This statement implies that images are not just problematic, but unethical, because they disturb access to the truth. The critical stance following from this would be to analyze and dismantle images in order to raise awareness and reveal underlying motivations. Ethics and epistemology as foundations to critique aesthetics. Within this paradigm, these three distinct modes of engaging the world become ranked, with aesthetics giving a subservient or secondary status. The logical inversion is that if an artwork is ethically and epistemologically solid, good aesthetics will be the automatic outcome. The relations between ethics, epistemology, and aesthetics are rewired through the writing of Jacques Ranciere. His arguments propose three major regimes for identifying art in the Western tradition. First, art subsumed under the questions of truth and purpose of image, ethical regime. Second, art valued for mimetic legibility within a structured hierarchy of genres, the poetic or representational regime. And art identified as an instance of suspension between art and non-art, the aesthetic regime. Within the aesthetic regime, the politics of aesthetics describes shifts in the relationships between what is seen and what can be said through distributions of the sensible. Ranciere's categories can reframe the architectural drawing. It could be described as an aesthetic that makes specific concepts legible to an audience initiated in its manners of production and interpretation. Its politics, determined by epistemological foundations established and monitored by the discipline, one goal of which was to redistribute the labor of construction from craft to the trained intellect and judgment of the architect. Judgment of aesthetic value is determined through reason and concept, not the seduction of material, decorative trends, or visual spectacle. This description locates architectural drawing between Ranciere's ethical and representational regimes. There are, of course, many species of architectural mediations with various histories and uses and implications. These can be analyzed for a number of reasons, but when addressed as a range of aesthetic propositions, it becomes increasingly difficult to divide them all into two simple categories of drawing versus image. They are all mediations, they are all images. And instead, if attention is focused on their aesthetic propositions, we can begin to understand their different political implications regarding Ranciere's distribution of the sensible. This flattened hierarchy could prove extremely helpful for our current situation, where architectural mediations are primarily processed through computation and consumed through digital distribution. A digital model handles the metrics and translations of an architectural design. This downgrades the necessity of traditional drawings for the pragmatics of construction. But at multiple points in the design process, visual images are still required for the work to be evaluated, communicated, and argued. Different representations come to reflect, a choice between imaging modes. The choice can be based on the content of the subject matter, the format of the dissemination, the association to historical paradigms, discursive lineage of argumentation, the audience. Any digital model can be rendered to look like a painting, a cartoon, a photograph, or a drawing. It can be rendered to resemble the appearance of orthographic projection, a section cut, or an axonometric perspective view. Important to note is that although the digital model is data, it is not an image, Every visual manifestation is a momentary algorithmic translation of data into luminous pixels for the evaluation of human eyes. These are images in the most traditional sense, even if technologically different than graphite pigment and chemical emulsion. It has become prevalent over the past few decades to attribute major shifts in contemporary architecture to the influence of the computer, with the outcome of either condemnation or celebration following in its wake. Architecture is by and large comfortable with both of these positions, for they leave unquestioned the epistemological basis that representation is determined by mastery of a technical medium. The debate is primarily over what constitutes mastery for contemporary architecture. Jacques Ranciere asks us to reconsider this explanation. What if digital computation is not the driver of a paradigm shift, but instead the current interface of a longer aesthetic transformation? To quote Ranciere, Walter Benjamin's thesis presupposes something different, which seems questionable to me: the deduction of the aesthetic and political properties of a form of art from its technical properties. Mechanical arts, qua mechanical arts, would result in a change of artistic paradigm and a new relationship between art and its subject matter. This proposition refers back to one of modernism's main theses. The difference between the arts is linked to the difference between their technological conditions or their specific medium or material. This link between the aesthetic and the ontotechnological has, in fact, been subjected to the general fate of modernist categories. It is thus necessary, in my opinion, to take things the other way around. In order for the mechanical arts to be able to confer visibility on the masses, or rather on anonymous individuals, they first need to be recognized as arts. That is to say, they need to first be recognized as something other than the techniques of reproduction or transmission. Not only did the aesthetic regime begin well before the arts of mechanical reproduction, but it is actually this regime that has made them possible by its new way of thinking art in its subject matter. For Ranciere, the aesthetic regime begins in 19th century literature. This artwork pushed against narrative interpretation structured through a hierarchy of genre conventions. The aesthetic regime instead focused attention on detailed episodic descriptions of the everyday, creating an aesthetic tension between reality and representation termed realism. Technologies of image making, such as photography and film, would develop different aspects, but their aesthetic was not a simple causal result of the technology or the purity of a specific medium. Images created through digital technologies are often devalued currently as photoreal simulations, as disposable copies. This seems appropriate if treated within an ethical regime. These images are distortions of truth. There are other instances when digital images are valued only if they make evident their computational processes of generation. This is to treat them not as truth, but within the representational regime of genre legibility, specifically the technological process of discrete code. But all visual manifestations created through a digital algorithm are fundamentally different from their data. They all dissemble reality towards a hyperreality. In this, they are images parallel to images, not secondary copies of reality outside the computer. Within the aesthetic regime, computationally generated images operate in the tensions between resemblance and dissemblance. Image, therefore, refers to two different things. There's the simple relationship that produces the likeness of an original, not necessarily its faithful copy, but simply what suffices to stand in for it. And there's the interplay of operations that produce what we call art, or precisely an alteration of resemblance. Ranciere reiterates this point a few paragraphs later. The images of art are operations that produce a discrepancy, a dissemblance. The question of dissemblance and its tension with resemblance is identified as a fundamental issue for all images that are to be considered art. There are two primary manners in which Ranciere identifies this friction, or this interruption of resemblance. One is for there to be a disjunction between what is shown and what is said. The other interruption is through the introduction of a mute, blunt presence. Ranciere would describe this as a presentation of presence, the affective pleasure in an image that refuses signification and interpretation. Furthermore, he suggests that many contemporary images possess both interruptions simultaneously. Let's pause there for a moment and consider what Ranciere's argument might mean in terms of our discussions regarding architectural representation. Just because the division between drawing and image as an antithesis is no longer valued within an aesthetic regime does not mean that drawing should be dismissed and photoreal images valorized. Architectural drawings as aesthetic images operate through the aesthetics of abstraction that is still critical for architecture. They isolate form through the substitution of contour for matter. They handle the superimposition of multiple systems of notation. They allow for a systematic comparison with past architectural drawings. These are all important operations for architectural design. But equally important are the aesthetic redistributions that rendered images introduce into architectural thought. In this, the work of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, Joseph Gandy, John Ruskin, Mary Mahoney Griffin, and Ezra Stoller need to be considered as positing crucial aesthetic arguments for architecture. The political suppression of images has already been discussed, and to raise awareness of this work is only a starting point. More important is to ask what the political impacts of these aesthetic propositions could be and how they operate differently within the tensions between resemblance and dissemblance that Ranciere proposes. For the remainder of this paper, I will focus on one single image paradigm, the photomontage. Beginning with the Berlin Dada, photomontage decontextualized and recontextualized image source material, resulting in the production of political effects through a dialectical juxtaposition of heterogeneous images. Montage posited a shock to visual perception, shifting attention towards the artifice of the modern industrialized image-based world. To quote Ranciere, collage can be realized as the pure encounter between heterogeneous elements, attesting en bloc to the incompatibility of two worlds. The surrealist encounter between the umbrella and the sewing machine, for example, manifests, in contrast to the reality of ordinary everyday life, but in accordance with its objects, the absolute power of desire and dream. Conversely, collage can present itself as that which brings to light the hidden link between two apparently foreign worlds. As can be seen in the photomontage by Jean Hartfield entitled Adolf, the Superman Swallows Gold and Spouts Tin, which reveals the reality of capitalist gold in Hitler's throat, or Martha Rosler's Bringing the War Home, House Beautiful, in which photos of the horrors of the Vietnam War are combined with advertisements of American comfort. The issue here is no longer to present two heterogeneous worlds to incite feelings of intolerability, but on the contrary, to bring to light the causal connection linking them together. But the politics of collage has a balancing point, in which it can combine the two relations and play in the line of indiscernibility between senses legibility and the force of non-senses strangeness. In this quote, Ranciere addresses how montage operates within the aesthetic regime as a tense balance between resemblance and dissemblance, between life as art and art separate from life. Appropriated image content is transformed into ostensive mute objects that in juxtaposition open up multiple metaphoric illusions. Photomontage is one of the key influences for 20th and 21st century architectural images. The transformation of Dada montage into what became known as pop art crystallized initially around the independent group in London in the 1950s and reflected a shift from the political ideologies post-World War I to the accelerated immersion in commercial advertisement post-World War II. The photomontages of Eduardo Palozzi, Richard and Terry Hamilton, and John McHale were fundamental in establishing the conceptual and aesthetic agenda for a generation of architects emerging in the 60s and 1970s. Archigram, Superstudio, Archizoom, Rem Koolhaas, OMA. These montages used the Dada dialectical rupture of disparate juxtaposed images, but shifted the terms of the social critique. The source material was found ready-made in the burgeoning advertisement and lifestyle magazine culture of the 1940s and 50s. Pop montage extracted idealized images of everyday objects and environments, especially the domestic interior, in its commoditized accoutrements. These operations are akin to the sacralization of the profane or the profanation of the sacred, as described by Boris Groys. The appropriation of the image object is only accelerated with the use of Photoshop to digitally post-process images. Today, all architectural images are in a matter of photomontage. This includes commercial developer renderings and disciplinary social political critiques. Both use the same technology and techniques, though they produce very different political effects. A situation such as this calls for a direct engagement of the aesthetic dimension, as any recourse to technical mastery or ethical truth will not clarify what is at stake. Furthermore, the drawing of architectural plans and elevations have also become montages today. They are now assembled through the recombination of elements as found. some provided by the software, some provided by product manufacturers, some provided by architectural history, all treated equivalently through the flattening effect of the image database we call the internet. The photomontage was born in the aesthetics of the Berlin data montage with shock effects created out of the dialectic of sharp-seamed juxtapositions. As this aesthetic has transformed over a century of usage in art and architecture, its initial political impact has altered. Irony has become a major effect in montage, distancing the observer from the realism of the image. Often paired with irony is the desire for criticality, seeking to reveal the contradictions in modern society through the abstract collision of images as signs to be manipulated. It is problematic to assume that the critically revealed seams of artifice combined with the wink of ironic reference will by default provoke a politically charged architectural argument. Our current image culture is so inundated with sophisticated, seamless digital montage constructing images for political malfeasance that it seems naive to believe that all that is required of us is to make the public aware of this artificiality. What seems more urgent in this situation is the pursuit of how aesthetics redistributes the sensible, and how the aesthetics of architecture can speculate on the potential tensions between the everyday and the strange, even or especially if done through images. So, to follow this up, now I'll just get to talk about the images because we finally got each other together and the words and the images are aligning. This last set of images we've seen, Andres Gursky, Horace Sasse, Thomas Ruff, are all students of Berndon Hillebecker at the Dusseldorf School of Art throughout the 1970s and 1980s. And they present a specific kind of photomontage, a photomontage that is no longer seeking to hyper-realize its artifice of seams, but to blend those seams into the construction of the final photographic image and produce doubt by placing the seam somewhere else. This image here is from Thomas Ruff's JPEG series. And here it is at high res. Here it is at low res. Here it is at high res. Pretty cool, yeah? You into it? Well, here's the thing. You zoom in, here's the low res image, and here's the high res image. And you realize that you need extremely high resolution to understand what Ruff is up to within the photomontage of these constructions. He has taken JPEGs that he's appropriated out of the internet and blown them up to extremely large dimensions so that you see every pixel. In doing so, what he's showing you is actually the compression that a JPEG goes through in order to be distributed across the internet in a form that can travel without heavy data usage. But in that, he's also messing with multiple resolutions simultaneously and showing you that actually every image we look at is a kind of photomontage. Is a photomontage of illuminated discrete pixels at different levels of resolution. And so when you get up close to one of Thomas Ruff's photographs, you all of a sudden see the high resolution of an abstract color field painting. And when you back up, you see the low resolution blur of the real image. We're actually very used to this because most of us spend our time these days looking at images on screen that are at a lower resolution than the screen. We actually often see low resolution things through high resolution interfaces. He's only flipped it on you so that now when you get close, it becomes more and more visibly apparent. Or the photomontages of Philipp Scheer. And this is from the Bildbauten series. And you can see what a lot of these photomontages that you've been looking at already for the last 60 images have been this faciness, this frontality, and this play between the abstraction of the almost architectural elevation and then the realism of a shallow depth that's implied by the image. But there's also something else going on here. So for Philipp Scheer, all of these are combinations of multiple images composed in Photoshop, clipped, extracted, superimposed, and then brought together to finally create the final image. So at first appearance, it looks as if it's a real thing. But there is something strange about it. And what I would argue is that this is still a presence of a seam in this work, but the seam has been displaced from the surface to the content in a way. So if we look at this and we start to look at it a little bit closer, we realize some very strange things. For instance, the patterns of the weathering are identical in repetition. Or you look at the reflections in the windows. The reflection in the windows bear very little to what is actually presented as being in front of the structure. Or even other bits of detail, like these stretched marks. They're just stretched versions of each other, digitally stretched across the surface. That little thing stretched up, that little tick of measurement stretched up again. So there is an artificiality being clearly communicated in here, but not at the level of the surface of exposing the seam of the montage. It's displaced after you accept the realism of what is being presented into the conceptual realm of engaging the aesthetics. One last example. Here's an image from Rue Klein, and it's an aerial photograph like we'd find from Google Earth, but yes, there is something odd about it. And what is odd about it is it's generated through a convolutional neural network that's combining features of the Himalayas with downtown Los Angeles. And montaging the two together at such a discrete, fine level of resolution that you can no longer find those seams in the construction of the montage, but in the aesthetics of somehow seeing a mountain range disturbed by the organizational system of this city. And why is this important? And why do we need to deal with this and not dismiss it? It is more and more the world in which we live in. Many of you might know this photo. This is a photo of Katie Jones. If you don't know Katie Jones, it's because she doesn't exist. Katie Jones was generated out of GANs, a generative adversarial network. She's never existed. Adversarial networks use random noise information and compare it to past photographs until you build up something that the computer judges as real. And you can look at it and tell, actually, that there are a bunch of strange things going on within it. And we need to pay attention, because this is more and more so the political realm that our internet is bringing to us. And we can either run away, treat it as a wasteland of useless or scary information, treat it as a wilderness that we need to tame and collate and collect and archive, or engage directly as an aesthetic regime of montage that we are all swimming in today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I'll just echo what everybody else has said for doing such an amazing job of organizing this exchange, and I truly appreciate the format. It's a pleasure to be here and also to engage with my three colleagues, and great privilege also to be able to hear a response from Jacques Ranciere. So my presentation, as you see, is titled An Apparatus for Emancipated Spectatorship. Theater, in both a figurative and a literal sense, is a recurrent theme of Jacques Ranciere's political and aesthetic philosophy. Politics is always about creating a stage, Ranciere states, and, quote, always takes the form more or less of the establishment of a theater. The interrelated machinations of stagecraft and statecraft have never been more evident than in today's Hall of Mirrors political arena. Yet it's not so much the aesthetics of politics, a theme with Benjaminian echoes, even if Ranciere's understanding is rather different, with which I'm immediately concerned here, as its reciprocal, the politics of aesthetics, more specifically, the inherently political nature of theater and theatrical space. Like the political arena, the theatrical one is a privileged milieu for what Ranciere calls the distribution of the sensible, the, quote, carving up of space and time, the visible and the invisible, speech and noise. The fact that this partage is enacted within a paradigmatically collective and public setting is what makes the theater a politically charged and allegorical micro-environment, one that's structured, moreover, by a set of fundamentally unequal relations between activity and passivity, community and individuality, knowledge and ignorance. It's for this reason that the live theater demands to be reimagined today, even if this ongoing form of aesthetic production no longer enjoys the prestige it once did and has to compete with many other contemporary forms of media and spectacle. How to disrupt or stage an alternative to the theater's spectatorial and scenographic regime is the question to which Ranciere devotes his philosophical attention in The Emancipated Spectator, the title essay of a book of that name, originally published in French in 2008. In his effort to theorize a more egalitarian and democratic form of mise en scène, Ranciere proposes to go beyond the two most radical models of avant-garde theatrical practice put forward in the last century. In what follows, I want first to try to grasp Ranciere's conception of emancipatory spectatorship in relation to both its historical antecedents and its spatial implications. Then, on the inspiration of his ideas, I want to revisit a project for a theater that I initially conceived when I was a student here at Cooper Union School of Architecture. I realize this takes some chutzpah, but if you'll permit me, I'll use the present occasion to rethink and expand on a project done some 4 decades ago. Theater as mise en scène for the enactment of egalitarian politics. In The Emancipated Spectator, Ranciere compactly defines theater as, quote, all those forms of spectacle, drama, dance, performance art, mime, and so on, that place bodies in action before an assembled audience, unquote. The two essential components of any theatrical performance, then, are actors and spectators. He writes, there is no theater without a spectator. In the conventional theater, he elaborates, the bodies that perform are active, and the bodies that view are passive. The division between the two parties to the performance, one mobilized on the stage, the other immobilized in the seats, harbors an implicit hierarchy of values. Activity signifies agency, intentionality, technical mastery, in short, vitality and virtuosity. Passivity connotes not just unthinking consumption and slackness, but ignorance. In this sense, the spectator is a paradoxical figure. On the one hand, indispensable to the very existence of theater, on the other, denigrated as a voyeuristic consumer of its art. The divided and unequal relationship between actor and spectator is analogous, in Ranciere's thought, to that between the all-knowing schoolmaster and the stupid pupil, an imbalance of power based on lopsided possession of a socially sanctioned type of knowledge. Ranciere deems this relationship stultifying for the pupil spectator, inhibiting her capacity freely to interpret what she sees, hears, and feels, to draw her own conclusions, and to make independent associations and dissociations. In the case of the theater, the darkness of the auditorium and the illumination of the stage literally materialize the polar conditions of benightedness and enlightenment. It's this bifurcated scene of viewing and doing, the spatially reinforced separation between stage and audience, actor and spectator, that two of the most aesthetically innovative and politically motivated theatrical strategies of the 20th century aimed to transcend or subvert. Associated above all with the names of Artaud and Brecht, the two share a common enemy, namely the bourgeois theater's tradition of mimetic illusionism, a form of representation in which actors emote and recite scripted words in front of a backdrop of naturalistic scenery. But as Ranciere elaborates in the Emancipated Spectator, the respective strategies involve diametric aesthetics and, politically speaking, very different visions of the future community they aspire to bring into being. Antonin Artaud's living theater is anarchic and anti-rationalist. At once violent and visceral, a theater of cruelty, and metaphysical intellectual, its aim is to break through language in order to touch life. The performance is to be all immersive, quote, convulsive and passionate, in revolt against the blandishments of modern psychologism and humanism. Artaud wants to mobilize aesthetic resources that precede and exceed everyday expression and communication, addressing him first of all to the senses rather than the intellect. Ideally presented without stage or auditorium, it should take place in an empty room with spectators in the center and actors circling around them. There should be overwhelming sound effects and dramatic lighting. Unfortunately, Artaud had little chance to put these ideas into action during his short and troubled life. What you're looking at here is a scene from Peter Weiss's play, The Persecution and Assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, at the Schiller Theater in West Berlin, 1964, as originally staged by Peter Brook, on whom Artaud had a deep influence. But Artaud vividly conveys his utopian vision in his own writings, drawings, and letters. As he writes in his 1938 manifesto, "The theater and its double," the stage is, quote, a concrete physical place and has to speak, quote, its own concrete language. He continues, I'm quoting, "I say that this concrete language intended for the senses and independent of speech has first to satisfy the senses, that there is a poetry of the senses as there is a poetry of language. And this concrete physical language to which I refer is truly theatrical only to the degree that the thoughts it expresses are beyond the reach of spoken language." Taking his inspiration from the traditions of pantomime and Balinese theater, Artaud calls for a solidified material language, a, quote, poetry in space. But first, Western culture, which, quote, stinks of decadence and pus, must be destroyed. To do so, it's necessary to shatter the existing relations between words and things, to induce physical shock, quote, to divide and distribute it actively in space. Also inspiring Artaud's pursuit of a materially and spatially embodied theatricality are symbolist poetics, from the concrete poetry of Mallarmé. Above all, the aleatory, choreographic impagination of Un coup de dés, a throw of the dice will never abolish chance, to the lapidary theatrical imagination of Maurice Maeterlinck, about which Artaud writes, quoting, "Maeterlinck's philosophy is like a moving temple. Each stone clarifies an impression, and each impression is a lesson. In no way does it constitute a system. It has no architecture or form, only size, height, and density. The upper regions of the mind have plateaus as restful as the widest forest clearings. This is where Maeterlinck carries us along with him. He recreates them to his own use and for our use, with the imagery and atoms to which our human organs are most sensitive. I cite Artaud on Maeterlinck here because, like Mallarmé, the Belgian symbolist, playwright, and author, also figures significantly for Ranciere, most notably in the chapter titled The Immobile Theater, Paris, 1894-95, in Aesthesis, Scenes from the Aesthetic Regime of Art, a highly original contribution by Ranciere to the historiography of modernist aesthetics, first published in 2011. But even more important for Ranciere within this lineage, running from the fin de siècle forward to Artaud and beyond, and also including other early figures like Edward Gordon Craig and the dancers Isadora Duncan and Loie Fuller, is the Swiss stage designer and theorist Adolphe Appiah. Ranciere invokes Appiah throughout his aesthetic writings, the first fully to conceptualize a post-Wagnerian mise-en-scène. Appiah played a seminal role in reforming modern scenography. His theatrical theory has particular resonance for Ranciere, who takes it as an exemplary case of the redistribution of the sensible. Ranciere makes this explicit in his extended exegesis of a statement by Appiah from his 1899 Die Musik et die Inszenierung, Music and the Art of the Theater, quote, "In the future, we would like to see upon the stage not what we know things are, but instead how we feel them." Having begun his career as a devotee of Richard Wagner in the 1880s, Appiah became increasingly disenchanted with the master's conventional and uninspired staging of operatic spectacle. This led him to repudiate the naturalism of Bayreuth in favor of a rigorously abstract, stripped-down stage from which all superfluous props were purged, and in which the interplay of light and shadow functioned not merely to create mood, but as the very soul of the scenic conception. The suppression of the proscenium reduced the physical separation between actors and spectators to a minimum. Developing his ideas in isolation, Appiah had the luck in 1906 to encounter the choreographer Émile Jacques Dalcroze in Geneva. Dalcroze was in process of inventing and disseminating an original system of gymnastic exercises called Eurythmics, and he and Appiah immediately recognized one another as kindred spirits. When Dalcroze was invited 4 years later to establish a modern school of dance in the garden city of Hellerau outside Dresden, a reform-minded settlement newly founded by members of the German Werkbund along socially progressive and culturally idealistic lines, he enlisted Appiah's collaboration. And Appiah played a key role not only in the experimental school's conception and design, but in creating the sets for all the performances staged there until the outbreak of World War I. Ranciere accords Appiah's theatrical breakthrough, like Mallarmé's poetic one, a privileged place in his philosophy, as I just suggested. As such, it's illuminating to contrast his interpretation of Appiah with that of the architectural historian Manfredo Tafuri, for whom Appiah is also a harbinger of things to come. In a chapter titled "The Virtual City, From Fuchs to Total Theater," in his book, The Sphere and the Labyrinth, Avant-Gardes in Architecture from Piranesi to the 1970s, the Italian historian suggests that notwithstanding Appiah's poetic and prophetic anti-representationalism, his pursuit of an impossible reconciliation between art and life was no less a total form than the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk it was reacting against, albeit coming from a minimalist rather than a maximalist sensibility. Exalting the Dalcrozian body's harmonious organic fluidities and freedom of movement against a spatial backdrop of eternality. The hallucinating bareness, that's Tafuri, of Appiah's sets is seen as a compensatory effort to ward off and counteract the chaotic, fragmenting forces of the modern metropolis. Appiah's vision was further embodied at Hellerau in the architecture of the building in which it was housed. Designed by Heinrich Tessenel with Appiah's programmatic input and displaying a mystical yin-yang symbol on the pediment above its Grecian portico, the festival hall was the community's ceremonial and spiritual centerpiece. For Tafuri, the line from Appiah and Tessenel leads to the Stoic architectural philosophy of Mies van der Rohe, more than to the anarchic and transgressive vitalism of Artaud. Its aura of totalizing, solemnified spectacle also raises the specter of Walter Benjamin's aestheticization of politics. Yet whatever affective affinity Ranciere might feel with Appiah's and Artaud's aesthetics, he's not unaware of these contradictions. Looking back at the 20th century, he cannot escape a tragic sense of history. Today, it's no longer tenable, Ranciere admits, to cling to mystical, metaphysical beliefs in the purifying ritual in which a community is put in possession of its own energies. In the wake of the century's catastrophic events, as well as the disillusionments of postmodernism, it's difficult to sustain romantic beliefs in the myth of organic community, and quite possible to feel jaded. We have seen, Ranciere writes, so many theatrical representations claiming to be not spectacles, but community ceremonies. And even today, despite all the postmodern skepticism about the desire to change existence, we see so many installations and spectacles transformed into religious mysteries, unquote. Under such circumstances, one can hardly be scandalized in the 21st century, I'm quoting again, to hear it said that words are merely words, spectacles are merely spectacles. Better than, I'm quoting again, to dismiss the fantasies of the Word made flesh. Yet a no less dry-eyed reckoning is due, Ranciere argues, with respect to the once revolutionary theater of Bertolt Brecht. Brecht's theatrical politics, reflecting a more orthodox left-wing position, derived from the epic theater of Erwin Piscator, with whom Brecht collaborated on a number of productions in the 1920s, and also drew heavily on the theory and practice of the Soviet avant-garde, in particular, its concepts of estrangement, montage, and the bearing of the device. Brecht's aim was to prepare the spectators of Weimar Germany for a future role as engaged and productive citizens in a realized socialist order. Through artful deployment of sound and light effects, film and slide projections, placards, and other deliberately rough-hewn accoutrements, he sought to win over his working-class audiences by entertaining them while at the same time calling their attention to the invisible plane, the fourth wall, separating them from the truth of their situation. The heightening of the viewer's sense of distantiation and artifice was intended to have both an alienating and an activating effect. Critical distance, Brecht claimed, at once, quote, turns the spectator into an observer, but arouses his capacity for action, unquote. Yet Brecht's critique of ideology is just as exhausted as Artaud's body mysticism, Ranciere argues, in The Emancipated Spectator and elsewhere. Quote, far from the happy pedagogies of demystified consciousness, he writes, Brecht experiments with something like the impotence of truth, unquote. The method honed by the German director as a means to rouse viewers from lethargic submission to their given situation is no longer the royal road to emancipation. In late capitalist society, the Verfremdungseffekt, alienation effect, too, has been thoroughly consumed. Reducing performance to propaganda, Brecht's didactic Marxist dialectics are little different from the stultifying lesson of the schoolmaster. While Guy Debord would give the critique of separation one last hurrah in the 1960s, today, militant last stands of this kind appear nostalgic and naive. Quote, we no longer live in the days when playwrights wanted to explain to their audience the truth of social relations and ways of struggling against capitalist illusion, Ranciere writes in The Emancipated Spectator. How then does Ranciere propose to address the inequities of doing, seeing, saying, and sensing? Given that the paths of both Artaud and Brecht are foreclosed, what strategy of emancipation is still viable in the latter-day society of spectacle? What is Ranciere's third way? On the penultimate page of The Emancipated Spectator, he holds out the following alternative. There remains a third way that aims not to amplify effects, but to problematize the cause-effect relationship itself and the set of presuppositions that sustain the logic of stultification. Faced with the hyper-theater that wants to transform representation into presence and passivity into activity, it proposes instead to revoke the privilege of vitality and communitarian power accorded the theatrical stage, so as to restore it to an equal footing with the telling of a story, the reading of a book, or the gaze focused on an image. In sum, it proposes to conceive it as a new scene of equality where heterogeneous performances are translated into one another. For in all these performances, what is involved is linking what one knows with what one does not know, being at once a performer deploying her skills and a spectator observing what these skills might produce in a new context among other spectators. This new intellectual adventure requires spectators who play the role of active interpreters, who develop their own translation in order to appropriate the story and make it their own story. An emancipated community is a community of narrators and translators. If I understand this narrator-translator model correctly, this new intellectual adventure, what's at stake for Ranciere is not the abolition of the role of the spectator, which by definition would mean abolishing the theater itself, or the fusion of actor and spectator, ditto, but rather an ascription of equal validity and agency to the respective activities that paradigmatically constitute the theatrical event. This means recognizing the spectators seeing and sensing, translating, as no less valuable than the actors doing and saying, storytelling, each role demanding its own measure of active intelligence. But what exactly is going to jumpstart this recognition process? By what mechanism are spectators to be released from their habitual quiescence and acquiescence? How might a different material and aesthetic assemblage of theater ideas, as Alain Badiou has reframed the theatrical problematic, bring about Ranciere's egalitarian theatrical community? And how might a different spatial form conduce to his emancipatory redistribution of the sensible? From the horizontal surface to the vertical plane. I will now be so immodest as to present a theatrical idea that I came up with here at Cooper Union in 1979-80 as a senior thesis project. It's titled The Stage and Its Double, Project for a Vertical Theater. Despite the Artaud'ian title, it was probably closer in inspiration to Brecht and de Boer at the time, but today I want to try to think about it in relation to Ranciere's ideas. I show you some of my sketches and drawings, not without a little hesitation, as they're rather primitive. Among my inevitable reference points at the time were John Haydock's wall houses and the architectural imagery of Aldo Rossi, who had taught at Cooper Union the previous year and whose writings I was then involved in editing for American publication. Of course, this was also the heyday of postmodernism. The Strada Novissima would open at the Venice Biennale the summer after I graduated. But having come to Cooper with a literary background, I was especially immersed in the poetics of the theater of the absurd, and I became fascinated with the history of set design, stage machinery, and perspectival illusionism, spending the first half of the academic year doing research on those topics. Here, slightly edited, is my original description of the project. So the four components of the theater are as follows. The audience wall. The traditional orchestra seating arrangement has been replaced with a vertical slab, an egg crate construction consisting of 108 individual boxes, each to seat a single viewer. The boxes are accessible from a corridor behind, which connects to elevators on the two end walls. The circulation is invisible from outside. The stage wall, the same height and width as the audience wall. This is also a type of egg crate construction, with larger openings and a deeper section to take stage machinery. There can be as many as 9 stages, stacked vertically and horizontally, arranged in the configuration shown, or there can be fewer. Each of the stages has adjustable wings, providing different perspectival frames and possibilities for optical distortion, as in the Teatro Olimpico, and its own frontal plane, which can double as a curtain or projection screen. The curtain wall. Between the audience wall and the stage wall are a series of retractable curtain planes of different material definition, from more opaque to more transparent. The first of these is a mirror, which is in place as the audience enters the theater. It enables the audience, separated in its boxes, to view itself collectively. The empty space between the audience wall and the stage wall, exposed when all the curtain layers are retracted, is a key component of the composition. The scenery and stage machinery. As minimal or complex as required by the performance, the equipment and architecture lend themselves to the greatest possible play with lighting, color, and multimedia effects. The theater is suited to dramatic, cinematic, and choreographic performances, and especially to their combined forms. All kinds of new possibilities may be imagined for staging synchronized spectacles within this open house. Once the playwright, filmmaker, choreographer has been freed from the spatial constraints of the traditional monofocal proscenium or arena stage, the potential for experimentation and innovation is virtually unlimited. Here are some images. The audience wall from outside, the stage wall from outside, the plan, a plan, a section, another one. Okay, 40 years later, I want especially to stress the third wall. There is no fourth wall. The third wall, the curtain wall, which I'll also call the mirror stage, is not adequately represented here. The audience's initial experience of viewing itself as alone together, to pick up on an idea Ranciere elaborates in his essay, aesthetic separation, aesthetic community, is crucial. But togetherness is purely representational. That is, it's available here only as a two-dimensional image. Just as, in a variation on Lacan's theorization of the infant who sees herself as others see her and as a figural whole when she views herself for the first time in the mirror, the spectators in the vertical theater recognize themselves as a collectivity only upon seeing themselves reflected back to themselves in the grid of boxes. I also want to underscore the ambiguity of the boxes. They're meant partly as an ironic comment on the aristocratic seats enjoyed by the most privileged class of theatergoers, and at the same time, they're intended to have a carceral quality. It's important that each door shut automatically with an audible click once the spectator has entered it and taken her seat. I won't add much concerning the stage wall. I was preoccupied at the time with working out practical matters like sight lines and movable partitions, but also with more theoretical issues of perspectivalism, positionality, and framing. These are still of interest. To go back to the third wall, this component should have been articulated much more decisively. That is to say, it should have been fully detached from the stage wall and treated as a true mediating plane. It should retract into a slot in the floor or ground, making palpable the empty space between the other two walls, literally functioning as a vanishing mediator. As I suggest in my original statement, it should be of transformable materiality, potentially exploiting the optical properties of one-way and two-way glass, front and back projection, holography, etc. The technical requirements for these optical variations could give rise to an oscillation between darkness and light. The interplay of opacity, translucency, and transparency could function somewhat like the plane/pane of Duchamp's Grand Verre as an aesthetic delay, deferring the ultimate confrontation between spectators and actors, forcing the issue of reflection both literally and figuratively. It also occurs to me now that the audience wall and the stage wall could be placed on runners or grooves in the ground and mechanically slid apart from the central curtain wall plane in opposite directions as the performance begins. In other words, the theatrical container would begin as a closed box, then open outward, revealing its tripartite nature. Alternatively, the two outer walls, initially embedded flat in the ground plane, could be flipped up 90 degrees like the screen of a laptop computer or clamshell, as if rotating metaphorically from a horizontal auditorium floor through a slope or raked seating arrangement to the ultimate vertical position in which the axis of the seating becomes the same as that of the wall parallel to it, and also resembles the screen in a movie theater. And I want to acknowledge that these two diagrams were made literally at the 11th hour last night or even later by my student here, Sally Chen. Sally, thank you so much. I realize that my theater machine might be seen as a large-scale gadget or toy. There isn't sufficient time-space to respond to this objection here, except to note that mechanical apparatus and technical virtuosity are integral to the history of theater. My project foregrounds questions about the interrelations of art, technology, and the body, and about human, non-human assemblages and interfaces that are more relevant than ever today. Apropos of staging a redistribution, a disruption of the sensible a la Ranciere, though, I'd like to offer a final set of thoughts on the relationship between the horizontal surface and the vertical plane. I'll make my point by counterposing two transformative actions undertaken within the history of 20th century art practices, one by a painter, the other by a dancer. By laying the canvas on the floor and kinetically pouring and splashing paint on it, Jackson Pollock in the early 1950s achieved something comparable to Mallarmé's radical gesture half a century earlier, turning a calligraphic art form into a choreographic one. Conversely, with Man walking down the side of a building, one of her best-known equipment dances, performed in 1970, choreographer Trisha Brown scripted a new form of dance, one that made the technically assisted body into a form of mural art. Each of these axial shifts within its respective historical and disciplinary context had the effect of altering the, quoting Ranciere, cartography of the perceptible, the thinkable, and the feasible. Could the staging of a disruption of spatial orientation in the theater have a similar aesthetic political effect? Could the transfer from horizontality to verticality reconceptualize the spectacle of separation as a less supine, more erect and active confrontation between the parts of actor and spectator? Could an allegorical architecture like the one proposed, quote, reframe the relation between bodies, the world they live in, and the way they are equipped to handle it? These last words come from Ranciere's aesthetic separation, aesthetic community. And I'll close with a longer passage from this essay. And he writes, modern choreography first strips the dancer's expressive body of its traditional mimetic capacities and then reduces it to the immobility of the statue in order to release the potentialities of new, as yet unseen bodies from that immobility. In the same way, Mallarmé's poem appears as the divination of the mute language written on the naked floor by the dancer's feet. And the metteur en scène, in search of the living artwork in the cathedral of the future, Adolf Appiah, wrests the characters of the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk out of the visual setting imagined for them by the composer and puts them in a space of geometric modules where the living bodies look like statues to be molded by the lighting, which means that it must turn them into shadows. Aesthetic experience has a political effect to the extent that the loss of destination that it presupposes disrupts the way in which bodies fit their functions and destinations. What it produces is not rhetorical persuasion about what must be done, nor is it the framing of a collective body. It's a multiplication of connections and disconnections that reframe the relation between bodies, the world they live in, and the way they're equipped to adapt to it. It's a multiplicity of folds and gaps in the fabric of common experience that change the cartography of the perceptible, the thinkable, and the feasible. As such, it allows for new modes of political construction of common objects and new possibilities of collective enunciation. Thanks.
Thank you.